Hello, students. Welcome to week 5. For week 5, we're going to be looking at chapter 3 in our textbook. And it's a relatively light week. We just have the one chapter in our textbook. And I did post 2 podcasts for you to listen to. You choose one of them, or you could listen to both for your discussion this week. So not a ton of stuff. The chapter is a short history of colonization and decolonization and why it matters. And so it's really going to go a lot into history, but attached it to a lot of the things that are happening today and the importance of it and why it's relevant to us in the counseling world. One of the quotes that the chapter begins with is, "We do not live in the past, but the past lives in us." And so, while it's important to be able to move forward from the past, we have to recognize that we carry all of our experiences within us. And generational trauma is a real thing, right? Like, if groups of individuals have suffered, racial traumas, ethnic traumas, religious traumas, things like that, and they react to it in a certain way, that's going to pass down the line to future generations and still have a huge impact. And so counselors will fail to understand fully enough the problems that people experience in their day-to-day relations with others if they don't take into account the shaping forces that give structure and substance to the backdrops against which individuals speak and act. So understanding that full historical, contextual situation in which these behaviors are occurring is necessary for us as counselors to fully understand what's happening. And so in order to practice our craft with respect, understanding, and effectiveness, it's necessary for us to understand the links between the world's recent history and the issues and challenges that face counselors and therapists today, specifically when it comes to cross-cultural and intercultural topics. And so it talks a lot about the European colonization that occurred between the 16th and 20th centuries, and recognizing that that's not the only colonization that happened in history, but the scale of that colonization was much larger than any other, and that's why it has had such a major impact in its influence in shaping the modern world. And so colonization has sort of been this focus on entitlements that individuals claim, the privileges or disadvantages that they enjoy or suffer, the expectations of life they can realistically expect or not expect, the shape of family relationships they grow up in, the identity stories that might enact in life, the careers that are possible for them to enter, the ways in which they make sense of adversity and respond to it, and the feelings that accompany all of those experiences, and not just the fact that a group colonized land, right? Like they also colonized the people, and what a big impact that has on those people. And so it's important to learn the histories of indigenous communities and colonization to understand what is taking place today among those indigenous peoples all around the world. And so again, one of the quotes they have in the book is, "We must confront the modern and widespread denial of colonization because it leads to blaming the victims of colonization for their own victimization," right? And so it's, again, those individuals who did the colonization or their sort of group recognizing the impact of it and doing something different with it or from it, instead of expecting those who had been colonized to be able to do all of the work themselves. In a lot of ways, when those lands and people were colonized, the individuals were forced to assimilate. So if they didn't assimilate into that culture that colonized them, it was a matter of survival. They could face death, right? Imprisonment, enslavement, all of those things. And so they ended up giving up a lot of their cultural practices and their traditions and all of that because of this colonization. And so there is this greater impact, really psychologically, that was happening with that colonization. All right, so counselors who understand all of this are in a much better position to make sense of cultural positioning of their clients and to help articulate their lives in relation to the psychological resistance in which we choose to participate. So it goes over a review of the history of colonization. It starts off talking about domination and subjugation, kind of what roles they played in it, and again, how entire moral and psychological universes were sort of destroyed and reshaped and restructured because of that colonization. And so they don't stop at dominating and controlling geography and available physical resources, but they might impose their own language, their own religion, their own social and political systems of governance. And they regularly claim that they're superior to, whatever indigenous people were there in the first place. And so it talks a little bit about, Christopher Columbus and the ways in which his travels and everything, the way that he saw the people that he ran into in Hispaniola, and the way that he talked about them and the ways that they saw them, and they truly believed themselves to be much superior to the individuals that were in those places where they landed. And so again, it comes initially in the form of loss of land. It brings in diseases and illnesses that are not known to those indigenous people. It forces dislocation, genocide, and again, that subsequent destruction of the language and community that those people have. And so there's this term that they talk about, ethnostress. It's a complete disruption of the entire meaning-making system of a people, leading to internalized oppression that drives hopelessness, self-abuse, and apathy, which we start to see in these communities because they sort of start to give up, and they internalize the oppression that's being put upon them. So any acting out behavior, blaming, playing the victim role, self-medication, and self-abuse start to become prevalent in those communities. And we see that a lot with indigenous people here in America. And so we live in a world of fear and anger, and as a result, our thinking becomes paralyzed, our emotional ability is affected, and our relations are disrupted. Our ability to help ourselves becomes significantly affected, and those are the results of that generational experience of trauma that we talked about. And then to kind of bring it back to the assumptions of the inherent inferiority of those colonized people, those become interwoven into the dominating discourses of colonization and provide the rationale for doing it. And so since these people are less than us, they're inferior, it makes sense that we would have to go in and colonize and bring all of our stuff to them so that they can be better educated and use their resources better and all of that. And so it's justified by doing that. If we were actually to be successful in a civilizing mission, it would produce leaders among those colonized people who would stand up against the forces of colonization on its own terms and challenge its whole rationale. And so what it would truly look like to go in there and support people of that culture, of that geographic area, would be to sort of help them help themselves. Again, so raise leaders within the communities and not come in and become leaders for the community. And so, if that had been done, that colonization wouldn't have occurred because those leaders would have said, well, like, we're good, we got leaders, we're taking care of stuff, we got our own traditions and all of that. We don't need you to come in here and do this. But the discourse of the colonizers, it ends up they kind of found the points of weakness in the communities and tried to enter through those means so that they were able to take over and either coerce or force the colonized people to engage in what they wanted. So in all the colonized powers of the modern era, there was a deeply embedded assumption of the superiority of the colonizer in all aspects of life and the inferiority of the colonized. And so the next section talks about the expression of British colonization in North America and how we see it. And so the fact that the Christian religion, Protestant values, morals, work ethics, the English language, British traditions of law and justice, the limits of governmental power, the legacy of European art, literature, philosophy, and music, it's known all over North America. And so that shows you the ways in which that British colonization sort of took over anybody who was here and even people who came after. And so those subsequent immigrants who came over ended up modifying the culture to some extent, but not changing it fundamentally. We still continue to have those same things that were brought over by those European colonizers. So while the Anglo-Americans stood with great pride among like high-minded ideals, the reality is that it was only the liberty, equality, and basic rights for us, people who look like us, people who practice like us, and not anyone who, you know, dares do anything different or tries to change things. They were betraying their own principles with people who did not fit into that Anglo-American or white race, and they also didn't include women in that. So, you know, you may look like us, but you're of a different gender, and so you're not counted into it. On page 73, it has a little box about cultural appropriation, which I think is really important to highlight. Some people have a misunderstanding of what this actually means, both for, you know, challenging it and also for aligning with it. And so cultural appropriation happens when members of a dominating culture take up aspects of the minoritized culture and use it to mimic without the consent of members of that culture. And so they just kind of take it upon themselves to do it. It has to be carefully distinguished from normal cultural exchange where, you know, like I'm going to teach you this ritual or thing and you're going to teach me this, and it's an exchange. This is just something that we're going to take from this community. In a lot of situations where you see it happening now, in a lot of ways, the minoritized culture may have suffered consequences or had negative impacts because of that. But then when the dominating culture comes in and sort of takes it and uses it as their own, it's praised. And so, you know, one of the things that definitely has been a part of our history is individuals being, you know, criticized, reprimanded, and things like that in the workplace for certain hairstyles, for certain clothing choices or jewelry choices that may be relevant to their own culture. But then when it becomes popularized by the dominant culture, you start to see it as being something that is appropriate for the workplace. And now, you know, these individuals maybe were chastised for years for doing it, but now it's seen as okay because now the dominant culture is saying it's okay. And so you can kind of see how that is really harmful to communities. So they talk about by the end of the 17th century, most African slaves that were in America were born on American soil and were losing many of their customs and traditions because of that forcing to acclimate to the British culture. And so it talks about the violence that happened and the ways in which it was kind of led down through, you know, the British culture, and then, you know, the British settlers here inflicted it upon others, and kind of shows that violent pattern. Just goes into more detail about like weapons and illnesses and you know, killing entire communities of people. You know, just different types of devastation that were caused due to the colonization. And so then it goes backwards a little bit to colonization in pre-European societies. And so recognizing that this is something that has occurred historically, again, maybe not on as large of a scale as the European colonization. As we kind of talked about a little bit, the next section gets into the psychological effects of colonization. So not just with the individuals who are being colonized, but over, you know, years and over time, the continued impact that it has. And so there is a nice little chart on page 77 that kind of compares the way that some characteristics are talked about between East and West, and how the terminology being used elicits a strong reaction, and how that was purposeful to do that. But again, it kind of talks about the psychological effects of colonization in a bit more detail, and the ways in which that has impacted people. Then finally, we get to the part of the chapter that talks about decolonization. And so people in colonized lands have struggled to overthrow colonial political system for centuries. In some cases, all right, sorry about that interruption. So getting into decolonization, it talks about the history of indentured laborers, and you know, how they had it marginally better than slaves, but they did join forces with slaves who were resistant, and there were some that it talks about that were freed early in the slavery period, when people were able to join together. And so from the early history of slavery, there were white people who stood against the practice, but it just seemed to not be enough to overthrow it. And throwing off the yoke of colonization is not a matter of just a change of government. Systems need to change, systems of social organization, systems of thinking. The process of decolonization has focused not just on regime change, but on the development of ways of thinking that depart from the assumptions and practices of racial and cultural superiority that, you know, we kind of talked about in the beginning of this chapter. And so how do we recognize that exists, and how do we change that narrative and work to help people move away from it? And so it is, again, a psychological struggle to engage in decolonization, because many of those colonizing assumptions have been really deeply rooted and penetrated into people's psyche. And so it's really important for us to understand the psychological processes of decolonization and its effect in order to work with people who are affected by it. And so counseling can help throw off the internalized images that have resulted from colonization in our individual clients. And of course, we can work with advocacy. There's this really great narrative, it's called Michaela's Writing, from an individual named Michaela, that was just so impactful. I really enjoyed reading it, several pages long, kind of after this section. And so I hope that you enjoyed that as well. And there's some discussion questions that follow it to sort of think about after you've read their story. Like I said, it was pretty good. I think you'll like it. So it's a mistake to think of the forces of colonization as inevitable and inexorable. So we can make changes, and we certainly need to make changes, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. There's a lot of work to be done. And so the general consensus of world politics expressed by the United Nations is opposed to colonization practices, and international law, such as it exists, has outlawed them. And so, you know, that recognition that this is not an okay practice and it needs to be ended. But again, that doesn't mean that the impact of it, that, you know, the colonization that has already occurred is still there. And so how do we address that impact? And so that colonizing, and it kind of talks about the way that the colonizing instinct in individuals, that impulse, has definitely not disappeared. And so colonization ends up taking on new and more sophisticated forms about occupying land and economic control and multinational organizations, international banking systems, and in the ways that those things play a part as well. Counselors must be acutely aware of how the very counseling theories that we adopt may embody those colonizing legacies constructed upon Eurocentric vision, which we talked about in week 3, I think. But when we talked about the DSM, right? And so when we look at the different theories of counseling and the different interventions, the different psychological models and also the diagnosis system, the DSM, it is very Eurocentric, and we need to be aware of that. And that's one of the purposes of the cultural formulation interview, and recognizing where our clients are coming from, and really having a greater understanding of their perspective and their histories and the identities that they connect with, and the ones that resonate with them, and then the histories of those as well, and how that can all really impact individuals, so that we're not using this Eurocentric perspective to hold everyone up against this like standard that we need to hold everyone up against. Counselors can also exercise the choice to apply counseling theories and practices that are explicitly to support resilience and courage exhibited by the families and communities that have suffered the negative effects of colonization, and who have not only survived, but have restored their communities in the face of the demeaning impact of Western ideologies. And so, you know, how can we come from a different perspective and a different framework when we're engaging in counseling with clients? You know, just like every chapter, this has a response at the end of it, some insight, and some discussion questions to think about as you process the content of the chapter. And so any questions, let me know. We have our first guest speaker this Thursday at our meeting, so I'm excited for you all to meet Margarita and hear what they have to say. And so I look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks.